what we're going to be talking about for our last panel is something we've been sort of hinting at and alluding to for most of the day, which is the issues of police reform and how that fits into everything else that we're discussing in regional justice in Pennsylvania. I thought I would maybe start off with all of our speakers, if they can all unmute themselves and put themselves back on video, if they can.
Steve, while they do that, Carmina Taylor, in this instance, she needs to be the first speaker.
Okay.
She has, so
Okay.
instead of the last one.
Sorry about that.
No worries.
No worries. And we got Jennifer on. Danitra, just put your microphone on, and everyone else. So
Yes,
I'll go to Carmina first, but you know, there's no doubt that we're in a polarized climate politically, and obviously a lot of it is fueled by issues about systemic racism in the police, about police brutality, about what's been going on in the country over the past 6 months. And if we heard last night's debate, we know that the issues are not likely to be resolved anytime soon at the national level. So I guess the question is, at the Pennsylvania level, at the state level, where are we at? I mean, what are we missing in talking about these police issues? So, you know, are there issues that we can refine better, issues that we could just put behind us? Is a question like defunding too much beyond the scope of the debate right now? Things like that. Let me start with Carmina Taylor.
Steve, I'm sorry. They have prepared remarks, and then we'll loop back around to some of those questions.
Oh, okay. All right.
Okay.
By the way, I'm taking over as moderator, even though Katti is on your list, just to give her some much-deserved break from the day. So,
Thank you. So, Carmina Taylor, you're first on.
Good afternoon, everyone. I must say that in listening to Josh and the other panelists before, it really kind of reshaped my thinking on how I was going to be concise with my comments today. I just want to point out that over 1,000 people were killed by the police last year in the United States. And over the last 5 years, 111 Pennsylvanians have been killed by police, and 42 of them had mental health issues. And we know that there's a disproportionate amount of these victims are Black and Hispanic before they're white. So we do have a problem. I am a community activist, a BLM organizer, all of those kinds of community activism efforts and advocate. And one of the things that I noticed in listening to the state legislators and the agencies is that we really need to talk about on the ground level developing private, public, and community partnerships, not just with community organizations, but community leaders and community people. And what I was thinking about first is that we haven't really addressed the fact that there is trauma by the people that have witnessed these incidences, their families, their communities, and people that have not experienced it, hence the protests that occurred in Pennsylvania. One of the phenomenons that happened this summer, since George Floyd's death, Laura Putnam out of the University of Pittsburgh did research on the protests. So by August, there was over 450 statewide protests in 230 communities in Pennsylvania, and over a third of them were in rural Pennsylvania, rural white Republican counties. And one of the things that when I went to various protests, I looked around and I just saw people traumatized. I put on a protest with a group of my colleagues in June, and we had high school students in Montgomery County saying that as a result of George Floyd's death, it took scabs off their wounds in the racism that they faced in their school systems. And so what it brought to mind is that we need to move forward and think about how through these multifaceted partnerships, we address holistic awareness and training and discussions around trauma-informed care and necessity. We need as a society to really invest in those kind of efforts, because that's how we deal with the misnomers and the impact of all the things that have happened indirectly or directly to us. In terms of funding, I was really interested when that journalist talked about Butler County. Pennsylvania has a multifaceted amount of different types of police departments. In the suburbs, there's police departments that are funded by their taxpayers, but some are so small that the state police cover them. In the cities, they have their big unions. So I was talking to a criminal justice lawyer, and he said that what we need to do, particularly in Philadelphia, is look at the funding that goes to some of the unions and reinvest that into educational mentoring programs for girls and boys at varying ages, but focus on educating them through mentorship about law enforcement and about the court system. Doing that type of preventative care will help. Now, in the suburbs, I'm from the suburbs as well. I used to be an NAACP president, and I was able to negotiate and get 14 of my police departments, police chiefs, to sign on to a community outreach engagement plan. And it really was about taking a holistic approach of reaching all demographics in our communities, from preschool to seniors, to address how we deal with biases from police and from the community. And there were particular police departments that had, oh my goodness, I can't think about it now, but those small, the preventative, the mimicking of police force, there was a PAL program, but from preschool to seniors, we had integrated approaches to deal with all the areas in those age groups that have issues related or perceived issues with police, or how police exhibit implicit and explicit biases. So I think with the combination of looking at where the police departments are in Pennsylvania, what funding resources they do or they don't have, if we take it upon ourselves as activists, as leaders, as journalists, I would like for journalists to ask state legislators and lawmakers how we can reinvest, even at the lowest levels of our local communities, how we can reinvest in making a holistic approach in dealing with the trauma, dealing with where the needs are for education and awareness, and then bridging it in with training for police. I have just been a strong proponent of I think for me, it's now about humanity. How do we help humanity? How do we have empathy for people that are victims and their families, and people that are indirectly involved by what's happening with policing? So I just wanted to point that out, because it's really, really important that we keep it in scope. And until we really figure out how everyone can be part of
It looks like we've lost the video or the audio there. I mean, are you still, can you hear me?
Are you able to hear me?
Yes, you cut out for a bit, but go ahead.
Did you get the gist of what I was saying? Oh, no, I was just saying that until we all collectively come together, there has to be a concerted effort to bridge all the players in the big picture. We can't get to a greater solution. So again, specifically with Pennsylvania, I think Josh said there was over, 1,200 police departments. And Pennsylvania, people don't realize it's more of a rural state than a suburban and urban state. And some of these rural communities not only have no wherewithal about how to deal with race relations, but they don't have funding streams and robust police departments. So lately this summer, I've been trying to, with the statewide coalition for racial injustices, I've tried to look at what are the threads that we can bring together that incorporate rural, suburban, and urban community leaders to deal with our issues. So it's the We Can't Wait PA statewide coalition. And we just had an event in Harrisburg. But what happened on that day is I had about 17 speakers from various counties throughout the state that all had stories about someone being harmed by the police or local elected officials. And what I found from other speakers is that it was so valuable to hear stories from Lycoming and North Cumberland and Luzerne and Lackawanna County, Lancaster, Dauphin County, all of these stories, because I'm from the Southeast region, and we had 5 speakers from the Southeast region: Bucks County, Delaware County, Montgomery County, and Philadelphia. And the whole value in all of that is we were able to connect dots. Now we're going to spend time working with our legislators to figure out how we can bridge the gaps of support and initiatives and come together as a state to help other smaller communities out, not just Pittsburgh and not just Philadelphia.
Okay, well, let me go right to Jennifer. I think you underlined a really important point because it's not often talked about the issue of rural policing. Pennsylvania, as you pointed out, is a lot more rural than urban, and most of the talk that we've had, discussions about policing, concentrate on the urban areas and the big cities. Can you hear me? No, maybe not. But let me go right to Jennifer Gibbs, who's next on our list. And Carmina, if you're having a difficulty, please let Chris know and we'll get to you. Jennifer, can you hear me?
Yes. All right. Thank you. Yeah, I just want to follow up on that. We do in Pennsylvania, we have close to 1,100 police departments, which is quite a lot if you think about it. Yeah. And a lot of, speaking to what Carmina had said, and a lot of our police departments in Pennsylvania they're hurting for funding because they're so small and you have so few officers working. I talked to a chief this morning for a research project. He was the only full-time officer. He had, 4 part-time officers with him. And, when you try to think about approaching any change or training even from that perspective, it's such a hurdle. Even training for small town police departments, which make up the bulk of Pennsylvania police, not only is there budgetary issues to pay for that training, but in addition to that, they have to figure out the scheduling, and somebody has to cover that shift when there might not be someone there. So I do think that those are some pretty important things that we need to consider. I have a bunch of prepared remarks, but honestly, I want to respond to the question that Stephen posed originally about defunding the police. And I don't think that's, I'm going to tell you, I don't think that's a good word to use because I think that we could use a better phrase for that to get more people on board with the general idea of it. But I think that a lot of some of the damage in the relationship between the police and the public has to do with police misuse of force. And that's not going to go away anytime soon. So I'm a professor. I'm an associate professor of criminal justice. I teach the policing courses and I study policing topics at, and yes, reallocating, not defunding. And I'm with you there. But I teach the policing courses at Penn State Harrisburg. And one of the things that I tell my students is that, we have the police for a reason. And the reason police expert Egon Bittner wrote in 1974 is because something ought not to be happening and about which something ought to be done now. And this something that ought to be happening cannot wait until the next business day. It's something needs to be done immediately. That crucial element is time. And because of that, we give police the general right to use coercive force to overcome any and all opposition immediately. However, the problem, as police researcher Carl Clockers explained in 1985, is that something that ought not to be happening is not defined, and it's not restricted to illegal acts. And what happens in effect is that the public are exposed to the police in a wide variety of circumstances. Because the police are the only 24/7 government agency that responds to emergency, any new social ill that we discover falls to police purview. So we're talking things like homelessness, drugs, mental illness. These are now all things that police are called out for. And police have been trying to professionalize for at least the last 100 years. They want to professionalize as law enforcement officers, and we keep expanding that role. And when police are called out to deal with a situation, they're called out because emotions are running high. So they're called out to this wide variety of problems that doesn't include just violent crime or property crime or traffic. It's all other problems too, and where there's a lot of high emotions. And they are going to stop that something that ought not to be happening immediately using the tools that they have in their toolbox, which primarily is if they need to get control of the situation, they're going to use force. And that's going to cause harm. It's dangerous to the police officer, of course, but it's also very dangerous to the community. And no one leaves from that unscathed. And I don't think that's fair. I really don't think that's fair. So I think that one of the things that we need to do, first of all, is to figure out what it is we want the police role to be. We live in a democratic society, and that means that the community and the police should come together and figure out how it is they want to be policed. And so that, I think, is the first thing that really needs to be done. And I will tell you, in response to something that Carmina had said, I started my career as a victim advocate for domestic violence victims. My office was at a police department, and my partner was a police officer. And it was great. It was great for him. It was great for me. I was doing social work. I was able to help people. They would be able to tell me things that they weren't necessarily comfortable telling the police. And I think that that is one model that could be used to move forward to maybe help avoid some of the incidents, the police public interactions that may lead to situations where police might feel like they need to use force. So, that's one possible way forward that I think that we should explore and look into a bit more. And I will tell you that when I started my career as a victim advocate, that was, it was a few decades ago. So we've been doing things like this for a while now. Another response has been to change policy and to do it piecemeal. My colleague, distinguished professor, Dr. Sean Gabadon, who was an expert in race and criminal justice, he cautions against that. And one of the things that he says is, that people, especially people of color, are wary of policy changes because police can still follow policy and still engage in acts of violence. And that's not going to solve anything either. Another response has been to increase surveillance. So, we've seen a lot about police body cameras. And as a side note, police have been using dash cams for 30 to 40 years now pretty regularly. But we expect a different outcome. We expect that, body cams are going to change. And maybe they will. Personally, I don't think police officers are videographers. I don't think when they go out, they think about getting the best footage. So I have some opinions on that. But body-worn cameras can send accountability cues to police officers. People are more polite when they know they're being recorded. Officers have told me that the audio from the cameras help judges make decisions, and that the tech can help reduce some exaggerated complaints against officers. So on the one hand, they like it. But there is some research that shows that body cams can actually increase the use of force when officers have control over when they can record the interactions. And it's really unclear about how effective body cameras are, and they're very, very, very expensive. So that might be something that we want to caution against.
So let's go back. There's a lot of.
So I was on a roll.
You were. I don't want to break your roll, but I want to get some of the other panelists to come in and speak, and we'll get back to a lot of the strands that you left, because there's lots of meat there that we want to get back into. So let me turn it over to Danitra Sherman, of the campaigns director for Pennsylvania ACLU. Danitra, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you. So yes, I am Danitra Sherman. I'm the campaigns director over at ACLU of Pennsylvania. And when it comes to my organization, I can say that traditionally we have been seen as an entity that has been focused on more of like the legal routes as well as the legislative advocacy, and so seeing what we can do to create change in those avenues. I will say, and just going directly to what this panel is about, and when we talk about the changes that have come about and the swift need for wanting to take action after the death of George Floyd, is that when we talk about the killing of Black and brown bodies at the hand of police. And I think Carmina did a great job of providing statistics. This isn't anything new, especially to Black and brown communities. The only difference now is that we have modern technology. Everyone has a cell phone, posting videos. And so what we have seen and what we have experienced as a people is now being broadcasted more for everyone to see and understand what is happening to these communities. And then in addition, when we talk about police reform, for me, it's kind of hard to really have a very genuine conversation when we're not really getting to the nitty gritty of it all and understanding how police departments even came about. Police departments were built on an oppressive system to control Black and brown people and to take away those rights. So when we talk about how do we take, action, how do we work together and make change, it's like the police departments were not created to protect and serve all of us, only some of us. So as we are implementing these different police reforms, we have to understand that it goes a little bit more deep than, us coming together, the community, the police, to have this wonderful conversation about what each side wants, but also understanding we have to address some of those underlying issues that have caused a distrust when it comes to police in Black and brown communities specifically. When it comes to the legislative aspect of it all, we will always do our part to make sure that we are advocating for and pushing for legislation that is actually going to help people. We are not in the business of wanting to say, hey, let's pass this piece of legislation just to pass it if it's not actually doing anything to help the people who are being impacted the most. And a lot of times when it comes to legislation is, oh, we're doing this, we're doing that, but it's not really helping people. So what are we really doing and how are we really being effective if we're not actually helping folks? And then two, and I'm also looking at my time, but then in two, and thinking about the whole piece when we talk about defunding police, which is a conversation that we have had within our organization about how to best message it and how to best brand it, and that we tend to use the language more of divestment instead of defunding, because a lot of times people tend to miss the bigger picture that comes a part of what it means when folks are saying it's time to defund the police. But it's about how do we reallocate those resources, which Carmina had made note in one of our chats, but how do we reallocate those resources to actually help folks? Because when we talk about the reasons that cops are being called out to different neighborhoods and different communities, we need to talk about how are we playing our part to address those underlying issues, which Jennifer mentioned when it comes to homelessness, drug usage and abuse, mental illness and poverty. Like, what are we doing to look at the complete system and not just one piece and one part? And one of the analogies or pictures that I tend to use often, and I think is very important when we talk about police reform and what's needed for the community, is that we can have this wonderful machine and it broke down and there are 5 different pieces. And if we only look to focus one piece, whether it's, putting legislation or, talking about different trainings for police officers in different police units, if we're not looking to focus on addressing and fixing those other 4 broken pieces and understanding the totality of a person, we're not going to have a well-functioning machine. And so we have to really think about, again, from a legislative standpoint, what we are doing to actually help people, to center those who are being impacted, and not just putting in legislation that some people may feel is just an extra padded layer to make things easier for police officers.
If I could follow up very quickly on that.
Yeah.
From some of the legislators this morning or earlier today, how, in your opinion, how ripe or how willing are the legislators that you see in the Assembly willing to make those kinds of reforms? I mean, is there an appetite for that? Is there a climate after the last 6 months of attention on police issues and the pushback as well? Where do you think we are, particularly in Pennsylvania, obviously?
Yeah, so I can't speak for everyone in the legislature, but I can say from my opinion and my assessment, it tends to be that what we're pushing and what we're proposing is more surface level and not really digging deep enough to actually address some issues. I know there's a slate of legislation that has been introduced and passed and requiring for mental health evaluations and thorough background checks, and all of that is fine and dandy. And even legislation talking about chokehold, but it's oh, well, we can ban chokeholds, but then if there is a need or a use for what is the word that they use? But for more, I guess, excessive force or whatnot, they can still use chokeholds on individuals. So when we talk about the language and the legislation that's being passed, I think that sometimes we tend to miss like the different underlying pieces of what it is and how it's actually going to play out and be implemented. And also to understanding that because of everything that is happening, I think that some of our legislatures are more focused on jumping on the bandwagon for notoriety for themselves to gain exposure for their own advancement and not prioritizing that of the people. And then in addition to that, I will say in my final point is that I was actually part of a meeting with some folks, and there were some elected officials there. And after everything that happened with George Floyd, you know, the piece came up to where it was a kind of a moment where protesters were being chastised about going to the streets to advocate for, you know, what was happening, advocating for change. And my thing is, I feel like it's just so distasteful and such a disgrace to be in a position to condemn people who are, you know, protesting, especially peacefully protesting for change, when this is something that has been done times before and it's not anything new. And protests are what we need a lot of times to bring awareness, because, you know, George Floyd wasn't the only person or man of color who has died at the hands of police. And with that death, it really caused a chain of protests, not just here in Pennsylvania, but across the country, even internationally. And with that recognition and with that stage and that platform, it is forcing people to do something, even if they didn't want to do something, but it is forcing folks to do something. But again, my point is making sure that while we're doing something, it's actually helping people and not putting a Band-Aid on the problem.
Thank you, Danitra. I want to move to Frank Straub for a bit of a national perspective, but I want to preface it by saying that one of the most poignant stories I've read in this whole national debate about policing issues actually came from Pennsylvania. There was a killing of a civilian in Lancaster, PA, in September, which brought out a lot of folks in outrage and protest. And the mayor of Lancaster was quoted as saying, "I need help. Someone has to help me." And she wasn't talking about getting federal forces in. She was talking about people who can come in and help her develop and train and really create protocols for her department that, you know, would make sure such things don't happen again. I mean, that came from the heart of somebody at a local level, and it probably is reflecting a lot of people, not just in Pennsylvania, but around the country. And I wanted to ask Frank, who has been a police chief in 3 cities and now works at the National Police Foundation, who I might add has just announced a new foundation and a commission on racing and police, for his opinion and his perspective on what he sees around him and what he sees in Pennsylvania. Frank?
Hi, Steve, and thank you very much. And I certainly appreciate all of the remarks from the other panelists. I think they've been spot on. Just a quick segue to give you some sense of who the Police Foundation is and what we do. We were created 50 years ago. Actually, this is our anniversary year. And we were created after the riots of the 1960s and the civil unrest. And the purpose was to help reform police conduct, to help advance policing through research and science and innovation. I've been with the foundation about 5 years now, just a little bit short of 5 years after 31 years in federal, state, and local law enforcement. And some of the activities that we're involved in that I think are directly relevant to the conversation is we've done reviews, and we're in the process of doing reviews now of the police response to First Amendment protests. So in 2000, or following the Michael Brown incident in Ferguson in 2014, we did a review of the St. Louis County police response to the Ferguson protests. We also worked with the North Charleston Police Department in the aftermath of the Walter Scott shooting to help them reform their policies and procedures. And I'll get back to why I think that type of work is very important, particularly in the context of what some of the other panelists have talked about. We also have done reviews of protests in Minneapolis, Charlotte, Washington, D.C., Portland before the current events, and we're currently working with the city of Los Angeles and Columbus, Ohio, in looking at the police response to protests. We've done a lot of work in the community policing space over the years, and some of the seminal research that's been done by individuals like David Weisberg and George Kelling and Warren Sherman came out of, as you know, Steve, the Police Foundation. I want to go back to our work in North Charleston for a moment, because I think that it ties very well into conversations around how do we assist cities, right? Communities. How do we deal with this challenge of defunding the police? Our work in North Charleston was really to go in and take a look at and do a very deep dive into the dynamics within the department and within the community that came before the Walter Scott shooting and the aftermath of it. And we spent a lot of time with the community and with the police department, right, to really get a sense of what both were about. And a simple solution, right, is to throw the baby out with the bathwater, to defund the police and replace them with, I'm not sure what, but replace them, right? I think that what we learned in our work there, and I think it's relevant to the current discussion, is how do we make the police better at what they're doing, right? How do we help identify the policies, the procedures, the protocols, the workload demands that shape the police response to individuals and to neighborhoods? And so much of what we looked at with the Walter Scott incident was we started with a baseline community survey. What do you think about the police? Are the police in their arrests, their traffic stops, their interactions with the community, using techniques that are consistent with and practices that are consistent with procedural justice, for example? Unbiased policing. Are they fair? Do you trust the police? And what we found overall is that even in a community that was highly traumatized and rightfully traumatized by that shooting, that the communities recognized that they needed the police department. But what they needed the police department to do was to do their job better, to do their job more fairly, to use principles of racial justice in their interactions with the community. So our work then became not getting rid of the police department, not necessarily outsourcing police activities, but really focusing on the fundamental principles. And I think Danitra, and I hope I pronounced your name correctly, hit on that, right? It's really easy right now, and I hope I don't offend anybody by this term, to implement a whole bunch of prophylactic solutions, right? We're going to ban chokeholds. We're going to not use tear gas during protests. We're going to not going to do this. We're not going to do that. But fundamentally, we have to get to the issue of racial inequality. We have to get to the fundamental issues of disproportional representation in the criminal justice system of persons of color. We have to get to the issue of what is the narrative that we're using to define policing nationally and locally, right? We have to end, for example, the use of the term war. We fight wars on crime. We fight wars on drugs. We fight wars on immigration. Well, the use of war terminology in the context of narrative changes the dynamic and the role and sends all kinds of messages to the officers and to the community. And unless we start talking about narratives around collaborative problem solving, we're going to continue to go down these rabbit holes, and we're not going to address the fundamental issues, the foundational issues that are really at play with the dynamics that we're seeing in our communities. So I'll stop there because I know you have a bunch of questions and you want to
have. We had some questions, some of them disappeared from the screen, but let me start with one. I want to read this to you. It's for all the panelists. It's really well written, so I think the entire question is worth reading. It's from Joseph Takari of Spotlight. And he says the following. He says, in newsrooms, we're dealing with racial reckonings, especially around how we cover criminal justice moving forward. How important is it to give historical background of policing, aka slave catching, etc., in America whenever we report on police reform? Is that important to you all who work within this field? So Carmina has left us. She had another appointment to go to. So maybe I'll turn first to Jennifer and Danitra for their first responses, and then to you, Frank. And those of you who have other questions, please put them on the screen so we'll see them and we'll bring them up to our speakers. Thank you.
Well, it is true that policing was emerged. The policing as we know it in America has emerged out of slave patrols in the South. I think that it's the formation of policing in the North happened a bit differently, and it was more to break up strikes by union workers. So when we talk about the history of police, I think it is somewhat important to talk about. So it's always important to know where we came from, but I think it's more important to talk about what is going on today and how do we move forward with it and how we can build bridges.
Thank you, Danitra.
Sorry, I had to unmute. I would say it actually depends. I think that in anything that is being reported and what is being done, I think it's always important to give a little bit of context and background. Because as I mentioned earlier, when we talk about the killing of Black and brown people at the hands of police, like this isn't anything that is new, whether it's in the South, North, West, Central of the country, this is not anything that's new. And so when we talk about these things, it's like people are now, not even just elected officials, but are like invigorated, like, yes, we got to do something. And it's like, this is not anything new. And many people do not always understand the history of policing, and especially the history of policing when it comes to Black and brown communities. And also too, especially for, folks who are in media who are not of color, it also gives a break for Black and brown people to always have to educate our non-POC colleagues on what it is and what this country was founded on, especially in the policing context. So I would say that if there's an opportunity to do so, go for it, as long as it's done correctly.
Let me turn it around and ask Frank. I mean, you've been a police chief, you know a lot of police chiefs, and certainly there are some who do make that point of the historical legacy of American policing, but does it really cut much mustard with a local police chief in a rural area like Pennsylvania if you tell them, you need to know the history before you decide what your policy is going to be, before you understand what you're doing or what needs to be done in the community? Does it matter in terms of the kind of work you're doing at the Police Foundation?
Well, I'll go back to my police career. I think we fundamentally have to understand the communities that we're policing, right? We have an obligation to understand the racial, cultural customs, beliefs of those communities. I think that in reality, it's really even more complex than brown and Black, because within, like, what is Black, right? If you're from from Jamaica, your perspective of Blackness is much different than if you're from an African country. And depending on where in Africa you're from, your perspective is different, Northern Africa and Southern Africa. And so I think there is a lot of real deep diving that has to go in to really understand the cultures and the subcultures within the community that you provide police services to. And so you have to have that recognition that there are these narratives, these stories, these customs, these religious beliefs that inform the perspective of how the community relates to you as the police, as an authority figure, as a representative of government. And so I think, yes, you have to take that time to understand the community and embrace those differences, those uniquenesses, those strengths, and then you have to speak to them. And yeah, it sounds like a complex job. I would say that being a police chief in America is probably one of the most complex jobs there are because of that very reality. We can't deliver standard police services to anybody and everybody that are exactly the same, right? We have to understand where people come from. And I forget her name, the speaker that had to jump off. She talked about trauma, right? Community trauma, but there's also generations of police trauma, right? And there are intergenerational stories that get transmitted in both spaces. And I'm just going to take 1 second, or well, probably a little bit more than that, to tell a very quick story from when I was in White Plains, New York. So in White Plains, New York, we had the largest public housing complex in Westchester County. 5 houses, 5 buildings, about 1,500 families, predominantly families of color, primarily Black families of color. So we had a program that has been implemented now nationally where we brought young women and men from that housing complex together with our police officers. And they talked about, life in those public housing complexes and the complexity of trying to police them. But the story that I want to tell is very quick. We're in the middle of this dialogue, and this young man from that public housing complex looks at one of the police officers and says, "How come every time you see me, you chase me?" Mm. And the police officer said, "How come every time I see you, you run?" Well, it turned out that the field training officer for that police officer and the generations before said, when you see somebody run in a public housing complex, they did something wrong, so you better chase them. Mm. The family of that young man and his generations going back said that when you see the police, they're going to give you a beating, so run. Mm. So for generations, we had young Black men running from the police, and we had the police chasing young Black men, oftentimes only because that's the way they learned to exist or coexist in a housing project, and nobody ever took time to have the conversation. And so that's where we have to move, right? We have to move out of these predetermined spaces and understandings that we're in and get to talk to people as human beings and make nobodies somebodies.
So Jennifer talked a bit about the multiple roles of policing today in our society and the very complex roles. And there's a question from Mason Schroeder, the morning call, which is originally to Jennifer, but we agreed to throw it open to all of you. That a lot of police departments are now working on the model of partnering with mental health services, with community services, and going out to calls in a way that is less threatening. There's domestic violence advocate officer model being used in some places. There's the cahoots model, which some of you may know about in some cities. Lori asked whether any of you are aware of police departments in Pennsylvania that are using these kinds of models and that journalists could observe and perhaps learn from. So maybe, Danitra, I'll start with you if you're aware of any on your end. Jennifer, I don't know how you answered it, but I'll take you after that.
Sorry, I was on mute. Trying to think. I will let someone else take lead on that one because I'm trying to figure out the best way to formulate what I want to say, and then I'll jump back in.
Let's go to Frank. Frank, have you places in Pennsylvania that are working that journalists can look at or nearby that are story worthy?
I mean, I think what you're talking about is co-responder teams, right? Co-responder teams, basically. I don't know whether Philadelphia has implemented them yet. I know they're in the process of moving in that direction. I also believe that Pittsburgh either has them or is moving in that direction. So I know they're bigger cities, but certainly those are two that jump out at me. And I think that's the wave. of the future, rightfully so. And I think in addition to responding to persons challenged by mental illness, it also helps change police culture. And I think Jennifer hit on that when she talked about her pairing with a police officer who was doing her victim assistance work.
I mean, we mentioned particularly rural areas, which are certainly undercovered in a lot of ways in terms of policing problems. So, Jennifer, I'll leave the last word to you if you want, and then Danitra can come in if she's got some thoughts on it.
Just a quick note to answer the question. Jennifer Storm at the Office of the Victim Advocate for Pennsylvania might have a handle on co-responder teams. But for the last word, I just want to echo what Frank had said about this increase in this militarization of police, which has been growing exponentially despite, a crime decline that's been going on for about 2.5 decades now. And that can be dangerous to police community relations. And what we need to do is emphasize community policing and not only that, but build it into police performance metrics. My own research on public attitudes towards police, what we know is that people of color typically have lower opinions of police than do whites. My colleague, Dr. Jonathan Lee, and I have been studying the relationship between police-public social distance, the feeling of closeness with others, not physical distance as we're doing during this pandemic, and how that affects people's attitudes towards police. And what we found in our research was, again, we found this divide between how people of color view the police and how whites view the police. But when our most interesting finding was when people had a good relationship with the police, if they knew a police officer by name, if they felt comfortable having a conversation with the police, satisfaction improves. And really interesting is that race didn't matter. So whoever you were, if you knew a police officer and you felt comfortable with them, you felt better about the police. And I think that's really what community policing is all about. And there are some really great programs, departments near me, Swatara, Susquehanna, where they do have programs that require officers not only to make positive contacts with citizens, but, and here's the important part, but to document it. They have to fill out a report when they have a positive contact with the police, at least at Swatara they do. And that goes into their annual performance evaluations. So when they go in, they've got to talk about the arrests they've made, but then they also have to talk about how much positive contacts they've had with the citizens in their area. And to me, as a professor, that's the equivalent of me telling my students, this will be on the test. You need to do this. So I think not only do we need to push towards community policing and away from militarization of the police, but I think we also need to build it into police performance metrics. And I think when we do that, I think we will also, as I've been saying, bridge this divide in the relationship between the public and the police.
Thank you, Jennifer. Danitra?
Thank you.
Yeah, I'll jump in and I'll be quick. I will say, just piggybacking off of Jennifer and thinking about the police accountability piece, I will say that it's super, super important for us to have more police accountability as well as transparency in how things are being operated. And also too, when it comes to what is being reported, understanding like what's happening behind the scenes, police records, that is something that, the public should be aware of, especially when there are infractions with police officers who are, doing their job incorrectly or improperly, because I do believe that, the more awareness we have and the pressure that we can give to create change, hell to the yeah, let's do it. And then in addition to the piece about the co-responders, I'm not sure, to Frank's point, like what areas have already started implementing it, but it definitely is a step in trying to create positive change to do things completely differently, because it's very, very needed. And we think about mental health issues and thinking about that young man in Lancaster who lost his life at the age of 27, that should have never happened. But that's also not the first time, and in such close vicinity that something like this has happened. And so we have to figure out again, like what is it going to take and what is going to happen in order to make sure that, if police is called, like Black and brown people or people with mental health issues are not going to be afraid that if the police shows up at my door, I'm going to die today. And that's just where I stand. And again, when it comes to elected officials, definitely holding them accountable, but definitely working with community leaders, community stakeholders to put in a very cohesive and comprehensive plan to address the issues and to really create effectual change in the state.
Thank you, Danitra. Joshua Vaughn has a question that really segues from that. I mean, we do talk a lot about the high profile incidents like police killings. But what really makes a difference in terms of in communities is day-to-day interactions and police practices for ill or for good between officers and the community on the street. And that may be, as Joshua points out, the eroding public trust, if not as much, if not as more, certainly as much as the high-profile stories like police killings. So he's asking, is there a need for journalists to look more deeply at those issues? And I would add on to that, how do you do it? I mean, what would you suggest that journalists start looking at in a more systematic way? And this is really to all of you together. So answer at will.
I'd like to jump in.
Sure.
This is going to sound very strange, but one of the things that I would encourage journalists to look at is the municipal agencies in Pennsylvania are trying to get radar. So right now, only the state police use radar to catch speeders, but municipal police departments are looking to use it as well. And I think that might have something to do with additional funding. It could have something to do with traffic safety. But we probably want to pay attention to that, because if municipal police officers start using radar, what that means is that's going to increase police-public interactions that are initiated by police officers. And that increases the chances that people are going to be unhappy. That increases the chances that those situations might escalate, and that could potentially lead to some potentially increase in use of force. So that would be something that you might want to keep radar on your radar, but that might be something that you might want to look into.
Danitra?
So I will actually switch it up a little bit. What I will say, in just thinking about the day-to-day interactions and understanding how to do better when it comes to building trust and relationships within the community, is that not too often are we seeing or are we aware of like what positive steps police officers are taking to engage with the community. Like there was a point in time when I was younger, you can see police officers going to play basketball with like the local kids in the neighborhood, or just like having a conversation or playing like football in the street. I don't really see those things happening that much anymore. And I can remember like a couple weeks ago, there was a video that went viral of some police officers like playing football in the street with some kids. And it's just like, that also helps change the narrative a bit in how police officers are seen within communities, because it's like, oh, well, you just don't come in and arrest people or, wreak havoc or anything like that. So putting a little twist on Joshua's question, I actually would go a little deeper in seeing like what positive steps or what positive interactions are actually taking place or efforts are being made to actually change that relationship.
Worth noting, absolutely. Frank?
Yeah, so I think doing some ride-alongs with your local police department and seeing them across the range of activities that they're engaged in would be an area of inquiry. I think taking a look at how many police departments have crisis intervention training for their officers, the number of hours that are involved in that training, how many officers in a department have that training, because that's the counterbalance, if you will, to use of force, right? That if we can verbally de-escalate situations, if we can connect persons in need of services to those services, I think we have great opportunities to enhance police community relations, but we also have great opportunities to reduce the amount of force that gets used. And I think we have to, the last piece is fundamentally look at what percentage of police training is dedicated to what we might refer to as soft power, right? To de-escalation skills, to crisis intervention skills, to procedural justice, to implicit bias training, to how do I problem solve with the community? How do I fundamentally build opportunities to collaborate with the community, not just as leadership, but as an individual officer, right? And I think we need to shift that paradigm a little bit, because I think if we look at police training across the country, I'm going to say 60 to 70% of it really focuses on defensive tactics, knowledge of the law, shooting skills, and those hard skills, those power skills that are directly related to some of the challenges we're seeing locally and across the country. So I think a bit of a paradigm shift there could be very helpful.
Training is a really good note to end on. At the crime report, we had a reporter who was embedded with the New York Police Department at the academy for 6 months, where he sat with, he followed 2 or 3 new recruits, which is part of NYPD's new program of diversity, of changing their tactics in terms of what they taught officers at the start. And they often found that by the time they got into the field and they were out in the beat for a while, things changed, because the veterans in the department or in the precinct said, "Nah, don't even listen to them." And I just wonder, as sort of a last question, whether you feel that something has to change in how we train our police. I mean, most of the training doesn't last for long. It's 3 months or 6 months. In other countries, we know that it goes for 2 years. You actually have to have a degree, and you have to go much further. At John Jay College, there are policing degrees, but is it something that's worth thinking about nationwide to make policing more of a that kind of profession, if we're going to change it from a warrior type approach to the kind of approach we've been talking about today? And I'll leave that to you guys to make a last statement as you answer that as well. Jennifer, you want to start, and then we'll do a round again.
Yeah, it's something it's something that my colleagues and I talk about quite a bit, is more education for police. In fact, my colleague, Dr. Sean Gabadon, he argues that because the police have the power to kill someone, they should at least have a college degree. And education has so many positive outcomes for police. So college educated officers tend to be happier and rise through the ranks faster than those without college education. Those without college education are more likely to end their law enforcement careers with involuntary separations. Officers with college degrees have fewer disciplinary actions against them. So just, and thinking about it, moving through those 4 years of a bachelor's degree, even from a freshman to sophomore, you gain maturity, better decision-making. You're a little bit older and maybe not as gung-ho on jumping to forces quickly. So I'm a huge proponent, but the challenge with that though, is that increasing education requirements are going to be a huge challenge for police departments, many of which are having difficulty recruiting applicants of any background right now. In fact, some police departments, including Philadelphia and New Orleans, have reduced the education requirement just to increase their applicant pools. So it's a great idea in theory, huge proponent of it, but it would be very difficult to do in practice.
Not to mention finding the funding for it.
Right.
Danitra, over to you.
Yeah.
More legal education, would that help?
Yeah. So I will say, I do think that having an educational piece it can be important, it can be helpful, but also just understanding the lay of land. And we talk about looking at this work, or not just this work, or just work in general, and like hiring practices from an equitable standpoint. When it comes to requiring people to come in with certain levels of education, that is a privilege that not all people are able to afford and have access to. And this is coming from someone who went to school for too long and having 3 degrees, is that there are also things that you learn in life and through personal experiences and navigating through the world that you won't learn sitting in a classroom reading a textbook. So while I do think that there needs to be some modifications made into like how recruitment is happening, how much weight I would put on certain pieces of education, I'm not quite sure, because again, that's already going to be limiting the pool. I feel like in some regards, when we talk about like diversity and who we're bringing in, because again, education is a privilege, though it shouldn't be, but education is a privilege, and not everyone has access to that going into a situation or to a job, regardless of what their job is.
Frank, you're a John Jay graduate. Did that change your approach to policing?
Yeah, so I think that the conversation has to fundamentally start with the definition of the police. The police are peacekeepers, right? They're not warriors, they're not guardians, they're keepers of the peace. I think when it comes to education, I think Danitra is spot on. There was a time in my career when I thought, yes, college education was critically important. I think in some communities, requiring a college education could in fact be discriminatory because people just don't have the ability financially, or, you know, a single dad, a single mom who's trying to raise kids and go to work, and where does school fit in, right? And so I think what we want is really fundamentally good people that are committed to public service, that are committed to empathy, that are committed to accountability and transparency and to procedural justice and to keeping the peace. I think the education piece is to do so over the course of an officer's career. I think we have to look at what is the makeup, and I ran the New York City Police Department's academy for a period of my career. What is the balance, as I said earlier, between hard and soft power within the context of basic police training, and how does that evolve over the course of an officer's career? Are we addressing in equitable rates those fundamental principles of community policing, those fundamental principles of peacekeeping? Are we putting the right tools on the officer's belt as they advance through their career? So it's not police academy, and then we're going to go to the range once a year. Maybe we're going to do some first aid, but I think we really have to work on and develop those human skills that allow that officer to engage appropriately with the people they serve. And I use that word serve intentionally, because public service is just that. It is a service to the public. As I always told my officers, the taxpayers pay your salary, the taxpayers buy your equipment. The taxpayers should be able to dictate what the service you provide to them looks like and what the quality of that service is. And at the end of the day, you work for the community.
Thank you, Frank. We are just about out of time, so I want to thank all of you for taking the time out of your days to spend with us, and to our audience and participants as well. We've had a full day today with lots of material to chew on, and we've got another full day tomorrow. So those of you who can join us again tomorrow, we welcome you. And we'll start again at 1 o'clock instead of 12 o'clock this time. But again, have a great rest of the day and a safe one. And thank you all. We'll see you tomorrow.
Thank you. Take care.